our closing plenary on Beyond the Borders, Engendering the Sexual Futures of Black Religion. We are surely in for a very inspiring, insightful, if not provocative, conversation. Through myriad media, forms, and religious languages, our panelists will consider how we might think about Black sexual futures in more generative terms, and how these new possibilities can direct our scholarly, activist, and religious work as we move forward. We have with us today 5 panelists. I will introduce them to you in the order of their presentations. Each one will give a presentation for 12 to 15 minutes, and then we'll open it up to an open discussion between them, and then open the floor to you. First, we will have Amina Wadud, who is the Professor Emeritus of Islamic Studies and a visiting scholar at the Starr King, I can't talk after lunch, at the Starr King School for the Ministry in Berkeley, California. Next, Kenyon Farrow will present, and he is with the U.S. and Global Health Policy. He's the director of the U.S. and Global Health Policy Treatment Action Group. Following him will be Jonathan L. Walton, who is the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals at Harvard University and Professor of Religion and Society on the Faculty of Divinity. Following Jonathan will be Leslie Callahan, pastor at St. Paul Baptist Church, and then Walidah, forgive me, Imarisha, and she comes to us as co-editor of Octavia's Brood Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements. And so we will begin because we know that we will certainly be provided with much insight into where we go from here.
A'udhu billahi min shaitanir rajim. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I begin, as always, in the name of Allah, whose grace I seek in this and all other matters. For some reason, the movie The Green Mile comes to my mind in preparing for this presentation. How could a very large, very strong, very black man, with his size even further exaggerated through other cinematic techniques and special effects, be rendered so completely asexual? When I say how, I am inspired by Toni Morrison's book, Playing in the Dark, to mean as a literary construction. I question the language to consciously desexualize. Michael Clark Duncan, may he rest in peace, portrayed John Duffy, an idiot savant, falsely accused, tried, found guilty, and in the end executed for the murder of 2 little white girls in the rural South before the Civil Rights era. At some point, we are privy to what actually happened to those 2 little girls, victims of another man, a white man. Duffy tried to use his extraordinary healing power to bring back those 2 little girls. He was unsuccessful, and thus, when found with the dead girls in his arms, accused of their murder. From the point of view of the writer of this story and movie script, he is portrayed so completely without sexual guile that the audience is convinced of his complete innocence as the story unfolds. For not only does he approach these 2 little white girls, but an adult white woman in her home, in her bedroom, in her bed, wearing only a nightgown, with her husband present and asked to step back from the encounter. Now, not only are these two compromising locations for a very black man in a white imagination so completely desexualized in the same story, that black man takes a hold of the man parts of his jail supervisor, played by Tom Hanks, who had been overheard to complain about his prostrate. Duffy uses his power not only to cure Hanks, but elevates his sexual drive to superpotency and leaves him immortal. Each time I see this story, all I can think is, what a fucking imagination. While this story has little or nothing to do with the intersection of Islam, race, and sexuality, I think about the place of God in the imagination, which is where most of the answers to such a question would come from. I also thought a quick and dirty analysis could set the stage. I am not shy to invoke certain images or vocabularies. However, to do service to a heretofore unintroduced aspect of our collective analysis of black sexuality and the gods, I need to provide enough background to perhaps sound a bit sterile. This is because I will answer the direct question, are the gods afraid of black sexuality, from a particular theological imagination from within the perspective of Islam, the religion of 1 in 5 persons on the planet, including a presence in Africa that goes back to its founding decade with the Prophet Muhammad, when he sent a group of his followers to Abyssinia to escape persecution. After that, Islam proliferated in Africa, including for more than 1,000 years by the time of the transatlantic slave trade. Not only is Islam a major religion in Africa, it is also a major religion in all parts of the African diaspora. Some estimates assert that Islam was practiced by as many as 1/3 of those Africans caught in the transatlantic slave trade, with slavery something that I must return to. First, I must make certain background assertions in rapid succession. And since these will be rather sterile as well as rapid, I hope you'll ask me later if you need elaborations. Islam is a theological construct, is not racist. It is anti-racism and anti-all forms of oppression. Muslims, on the other hand, have practiced racism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, and other forms of elitism and oppression probably for as long as the historical religion has manifest. It is my task to distinguish between the theological constructions and Muslim peoples because the question asked is theological. Are the gods afraid of black sexuality? The word Islam refers to the peace achieved by the surrender of the human being to one ultimate essence or sacred reality, Allah, which is the Arabic for the God, literally. The framework of this theological foundation, Tawheed, or God's oneness, mandates unity in social praxis. Meanwhile, among the 1.4 billion Muslims, racism is alive and not so well. To this day, however, not one of them has been able to utter a single source from amongst our primary sources to justify or excuse such racism. This is necessary in our current circumstances when there's a group of Muslims perpetuating gross violence like beheading non-combatants called ISIS, who claim to have legitimate textual base justifying what they are doing. Now, this is not to ignore racism as it is manifest on the part of non-black African Muslims against black African, Afro-European, and African-American Muslims and non-Muslims in the complex diaspora. Instead, I simply wish to locate my comments first on how the source texts of Islamic thought and praxis are related to praxis, and then I can address problems within those sources before concluding remarks about racism among Muslims as it relates to sexuality. At this juncture, I make note, coincidentally, that such racism is also perpetuated by Muslims against others than blacks, if they are non-Muslims, as for example, in conflict areas between Muslims and people of other religions. So for example, the black Southern Sudanese are discriminated against and given unequal treatment before the law because they are predominantly Christian. This prejudice, however, is from other black Sudanese in the north because they are Muslim. Thus, race is not the factor. It just factors into the non-Muslim double standard. So my primary sources, I refer to the Quran, the sacred text revealed to the Prophet Muhammad 14 centuries ago in the Arabian Peninsula. I also refer to Sunnah, his normative practices, and to Hadith, the Prophet's own words as they have been variously recorded. These three form a triad of ultimate sacred sources which make no distinction on the basis of race or ethnicity. Instead, the Quran affirms, O humankind, indeed, we have created you out of a male and a female, and have made you into nations and tribes. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum, indeed the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the one with the deepest God consciousness. And also the Quran says, and among his wondrous signs is the creation of the heavens and the earth, and the diversity of your languages and colors. For in this indeed, behold, there are messages for those who possess knowledge. And the Prophet said, Allah does not look for judgment upon your outward forms or color, but in your heart. Even when racism is practiced by Muslims, there has never been an attempt to justify it by citing sacred sources. ISIS pretends its violence to randomly kill people is based on text from the Quran. Thus, Muslims tend to repeat ad nauseum, there's no racism in Islam, even to excuse gross racism. It is just that no one even subtly pretends there is faith-based support for this. I will contrast this to homophobia, which amongst Muslims is primarily supported on the basis of the Quranic discussion of the Prophet Lot. They also support their sexism on a combination of Quranic texts and a hadith. So that's the slippery slope. Upon this triad of sacred sources, Quran, Sunnah, and Hadith, in concert with local, regional, and sometimes global or universal understandings and praxis, Muslims have built a complex system of law, sometimes falsely referred to as Sharia, but actually should be called fiqh. Fiqh is a word that means efforts to understand that Sharia, or more simply, jurisprudence. I say efforts to understand because Sharia is about like the Tao, the way, the cosmic order of the universe, which is congruent with the will of Allah, the creator of that universe. It literally comes from the word that means a path to water, which is the source of all life, and as such, can never be captured once and for all. The law is indispensable with Islamic thought and practice. While there is spirit, theology, dogma, and creed, none of these has a place in Islamic historical and intellectual development except within the context of the law. Furthermore, all matters of sexuality are discussed either under medical treatise or legal treatise, and boy, do they discuss it. Overall, Islam is a sex-affirming religion. Although Islamic law strictly identifies the prescribed conditions under which sexual intercourse might occur, namely heterosexual marriage and concubinage, which I will return to. The punishment for any form of sexual intercourse outside of marriage is severe, but also subject to interpretation. No law came into being without human agency, and part of Islamic reform is to challenge any and all laws that discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity. Contrast this with there are no laws that distinguish any aspect of Islamic behavior or praxis on the basis of race or ethnicity. This is not to overlook places where an analogy has been made about the status of non-Muslim persons, for which double standards in the law are justified, using particular readings of sacred texts when these also overlap with certain circumstances already racist. It is not uncommon to see these collapse into quasi-legal but still racist terms. As for the example that I gave with the Black Sudanese, but a startling example for me when I was in South Africa was to learn that the Muslim legal thinkers there justified the prohibition of interracial marriage between Black, Indian, white, and colored South Africans on the grounds of a stipulation that prohibits the marriage of a woman to someone who is not deemed to have parity with her with regard to class, status, education, and religion. A man, on the other hand, can marry any woman when these same circumstances are below his own. This is called takafur. So, for example, when the daughter of the president of the Maldives fell in love with a Pakistani guy when they were in graduate school in the UK, his parents originally argued against their getting married on the grounds of takafur. This is generally what is used to justify why Muslim women are prohibited from marrying non-Muslim men. Islam is deemed superior, and she cannot marry beneath her. In other words, a woman is inferior, but if she has the superior religion, she is above any other religion for the man. This principle has been applied to prohibit interracial marriages in South Africa within the apartheid system by measuring the four racial groups as legitimate estimations of marriage. This is the only place where I have seen this application of the fiqh. Of course, there is an underlying problem with this construction of parity between a man and a woman because it is premised upon the inferiority of the woman and the presumption that she lacks agency in marriage or relative to her husband, so much so that if he is less than her, then she will be thwarted from maintaining the level to which she is accustomed. Critiquing the skewed notion of gender relations is part of the ongoing work of Islamic reform in which I have been involved for about 4 decades now internationally. It was the peculiar racist dimension in a peculiarly racist context that I found interesting. In any case, while no citations of text is ever given to support racism, in contrast, justification for gender discrimination and homophobia both are defended by citing source texts. I've spent a lifetime working on the deconstruction of such texts, but especially challenging systems of praxis and culturally based prejudices and discriminations that have been encoded in the interpretation and application of these texts, given the very idea that laws are human-made and not divine. The primary sources also have a system of priority. First, the Quran as divine revelation. Second, the words and actions of the Prophet. And then, in varying degrees, the interpretive disciplines developed from these two, which is where I place Islamic law. I build upon this system of priority to locate the imagined God in the Islamic answer to the questions, are the gods afraid of black sexuality? Theologically, the simplest answer from the Quran as revelation from God is that God is adamantly opposed to oppression. Thus, any form of oppression is human-made and must be human-alleviated. As far as sex and sexuality is concerned, Islam is a sex-affirming tradition. There is no notion of celibacy to connote some sort of spiritual or religious excellence, preference, or elitism. The Prophet is reported to have said with regard to the celibates in his time, I am married, and the best among you are those who emulate my sunnah, or normative practices. There are other elaborations on intimate sexual behavior. For example, the Prophet admonished his male followers to send messages before penetration. What messengers? Kisses and hugs. In other words, the Prophet prescribed foreplay. The Quran also exhorts Muslim men to marry if they have the means to support a wife, and if they do not, to fast to help with abstinence until they can attain the means. The biggest concern I have regarding Islam and sexuality is the prominent bias towards active male heterosexuality, with women as not only passive receivers of this sexuality, but also in some cases ordered to provide sexually even against her wishes. Thus, the practice of polyandry, multiple husbands or male sexual partners, that used to be common in the Arabian Peninsula was prohibited with the advent of Islam, while polygyny, multiple wives, was confirmed, albeit with strict limits as to form and number, and premised upon certain conditions barely attainable in most circumstances today. Still, a man is permitted to have more than one wife. He is also believed to have the right to have unlimited, unconditional access to sex with his wife or concubine whenever he wants, however he wants. Even after death, a man will be rewarded with 70 virgins for an eschatological affirmation of that same male sexual preference. Most problematic is a verse, we heard this mentioned in the film, most problematic is a verse that is interpreted by all the classical jurists to mean if a woman does not provide sex upon demand to her husband, she should be reprimanded, banished to a separate bed, or beat, however lightly. There is no such thing as marital rape, but this verse is interpreted to sanction domestic violence. Today, we construct a very different notion about how to understand this, how to counter its violent sexist application, and why we must do so within an Islamic feminist framework. The strictest aspect articulated about sexual enjoyment is the necessity to marry before indulging in it. There is no notion of sexual intercourse outside of the institution of marriage, which coincidentally is not a sacrament, it is a contract. Again, with the notable exception of concubines, who are constructed in the text as free recipients of male libido, who are not required to be married to so indulge, sexual pleasure is expected to be enjoyed only under the appropriate contract of marriage or nikah. Marriage is not limited to the purpose of procreation. Marriage is for pleasure. With regard to concubines here, I need to remind you that slaves came from all over, not just black Africa. Thus, white, brown, red, yellow, and black women were concubines and equally mistreated insofar as slavery was permitted in the sacred text. Sex outside of marriage is to be severely punished, provided that proof that it has occurred can be given. In the strictest sense, that proof must include at least 4 male witnesses to actual penal penetration. Other than a confession, nothing else is evidence, not even a woman's pregnancy. Not knowing that a man and a woman stayed overnight behind closed doors. Not even if the witnesses see what appears to be the two of them going at it, but under the sheets. None of these are acceptable evidence for sexual intercourse. For any extramarital and premarital intercourse to fit these evidentiary requirements, it must be tantamount to pornography, and you can guess how many men are making claim to that. Even though Islamic law has strict notions about permissible sex, and even though, in my opinion, that permissibility is entirely too biased towards male heterosexual pleasure, there is no such context where racism among Muslims has ever been problematic in its supposed textual connection. Thus, to trace the encounter with Africans through trade, including the slave trade, to various parts of the region where Islam originated and beyond as Islam spread geographically, there remains a tenacious tendency towards racism even up to today. Still, this did not automatically link to a perceived or projected idea about black sexuality. Of course, racism will manifest either subtly or overtly in every aspect of the encounter between the racist and the black subject. Still, it is difficult to connect Islam to fear of black sexuality. And while the authority to determine how God is imagined, what God is, or what God's opinion is, even based on those sources, is completely a human construct, to the question, are the gods afraid of black sexuality? From an Islamic perspective, I can answer with a resounding no.
Usually I'm the first to curse, so I'm glad that that pressure's off, so I don't have to, I have to feel bad about it, and I really don't. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, I'm not going to kind of respond to the direct question, are the gods afraid of black sexuality, but really think about, you know, some questions really thinking about the future, and the future of, you know, black sexuality as it relates to this kind of entity that we call the black church, right? And I think Jafari said it yesterday at one point, like obviously, and some other folks I think it's been named, understanding that this kind of notion of a kind of black church as a kind of singular institution is a myth, but it is a myth that we have to contend with, right? It is something that kind of permeates a lot of popular culture, a lot of thought about, you know, this institution as kind of, you know, ethical and moral corrector and barometer, not just for Black America, but actually for the U.S. in some ways in general, in some weird kind of configurations. So just to tell you a little bit about my, you know, sort of church story. So just to say again, so I'm currently the U.S. and Global Health Policy Director for Treatment Action Group, which is a research and policy think tank that focuses on treatment access and research for a cure or vaccine for HIV, and we also do hepatitis C and tuberculosis work. So I'm going to talk about HIV in particular as it relates to black folks, black gay men, the black church. So I grew up in the AME church, in my great uncle's church in Cleveland, Ohio. And when I was young, will be 40 in 3 weeks, so back in the 80s, when I was a kid, and attending my uncle's church on a semi-regular basis, one of the things I remember, it's been said here, it's sort of a, you know, blah, 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 of course, right? Our choir director was a black gay man. And, you know, one of the interesting things about him was that his partner, his name was David. David and his, had a white partner who came to church every Sunday and sat in the front pew with my aunt and us, who's the first lady. And it was kind of one of those, you know, everybody knew, you know, the situation. He was often introduced as David's friend, right? But, you know, was there. You know how black folks, you know, the way we say friend has like 10,000 different meanings. That's his friend. So, you know, so that was kind of, you know, part of what was happening. But, you know, more and more as HIV became so much kind of synonymous with gay men in particular, and the kinds of fears around how the disease was being transmitted and so on and so forth began to kind of become much more part of just the kind of U.S. and probably global kind of concern. Some things started to sort of change in those sort of interactions, right? So my great uncle, who was pastor of this church, I never in his entire life ever heard a kind of Leviticus, gays are going to hell, any of that kind of, nothing even coming close to that kind of sermon, or even in just his everyday conversation. But what started to happen within the church, and so I'm going to say this, not that I'm like really defending a whole lot of black pastors, you will never hear me do that. However, what I will say is that, you know, so oftentimes when we talk about these things about homophobia, the focus kind of is on the pastor, right? And so just as a kind of another sort of story, my uncle was not kind of doing that, right, in terms of his sermon or his kind of frame of theology. But that didn't stop what happened in the church, right? So part of what happened was, you know, when we would have functions in the basement of the church, you know, cookouts and potlucks and whatever for, you know, different events, there started to be a kind of whisper campaign, and I was like maybe 8, 9 years old and remember this very, very clearly, that, you know, people would go up and hug each other and greet each other, you know, and, but it was part of a strategy of also, or using that dynamic to sort of pass along messages about what David and his partner, what food they brought, as if so people knew not to eat it, right? And so I remember whole pans of things that they brought never being touched, you know, in the, you know, in the service. And so I raised that, you know, to like, you know, not do another like kind of uppercut to the black church, right? But to really, you know, I think really think about this question. I'm really happy to hear HIV be raised so much in this space, because that is not the typical situation, not just in kind of black church or sexuality spaces, but just generally the levels of deep silence that happen in a lot of spaces, including our kind of most political, even kind of quote unquote radical ones, right, is often kind of put to the side. Another thing that happened to me very recently was I was at a kind of conference for community activists doing, you know, work around, you know, gendered violence and work with men in different kind of black communities around the U.S. And I was asked at the very last minute, the last day, Jeffrey, you were here for that. You were there for that meeting, to jump on one of the panels to talk about HIV as a very specific and kind of homophobic violence in the context of the work. And so as I started to talk about kind of issues of HIV in the black community or whatever, one of the attendees, you know, in the Q&A said, well, you know, this is somebody who does like anti-gang work and kind of re-entry work with other, you know, presumably straight black men in the community. He, you know, said, well, you know, we know that, you know, HIV is, you know, it's genocide, you know, and it's, you know, probably man-made and all these kinds of things, right? To which my response was, well, we talk about, you know, prisons and the kind of prison industrial complex, police brutality, that whole apparatus in ways that we also frame as sometimes genocide or as having genocidal impact. And we will talk about the 13th Amendment and how it sort of allowed for the buildup of the, you know, kind of, you know, prison culture that we have, or the prison industrial complex. We'll talk about convict leasing. We'll talk about, you know, the chain gangs. We'll talk about, you know, Reagan and Nixon and the war on drugs. We'll do all of that shit, right? In a context of a conversation that we think about as genocidal, but if it comes to HIV/AIDS, we will stop the conversation that is genocide and run and walk away. So that's a problem. And one of the other, you know, kind of things that I want to sort of raise for us is that I think in this conversation is, I think one of the challenges that we often, you know, as black folks kind of our ability to sort of respond to things that we see as forms of state violence, right? Police brutality, extrajudicial killings of primarily, you know, or focusing mostly on, you know, young, presumably straight black men when they happen, what have you. You know, it's those sorts of spectacleized events that become the sort of mechanisms through which we can mobilize ourselves. And even some of the ways we even kind of critique that for, you know, kind of not focusing on, you know, women or trans folks or other folks who are victims of similar forms of violence. And those critiques should exist. But we often don't do is also have similar kinds of mechanisms or imaginaries to think about what mobilizing looks like in the cases of, you know, massive numbers of people, you know, dying of HIV/AIDS in this country, right, in our communities, or just the lack of access to health care and the very kind of slow forms of like death that we are also subjected to, that we sort of either accept as kind of sort of genocidal or and kind of pay it, right, as the kids say, meaning pay it no mind. So I want to posit a couple different, you know, sort of things here, especially when we think about this, the kind of notion of black Christianity, black churches, and their sort of response in terms of the HIV/AIDS crisis. So lots of things that have been written about, Kathy Coe and others, that, you know, we know that black churches, you know, in the early part of the epidemic, particularly black women in those churches, were among the first groups to respond to providing basic care to folks who were in fact dying. But we also know that at the same time that this was going on, that there was still a lot of, you know, kind of, you know, silence around the epidemic for many years that still exists. And also, I think one thing that we have to think about, I think post the kind of civil rights movement and the ways in which the black church has come to kind of epitomize the sort of seat of all the sort of radical or at least kind of progressive organizing and mass movement building that happened in that period, our sort of imaginaries have sort of made the black church the focus of all black community culture, politics, organizing, information, et cetera. And that is reflected often even in the government's sort of AIDS response in the US, which has put a primary focus on what black churches did or did not do currently in the epidemic. So just a few more sort of thoughts in this direction. I'm running short on time, so I'm cutting. So a couple quick things. So one, there's a research study that just came out this year from Clinical Infectious Diseases. It was referenced last night at the event with Bishop Flunder and Donnie, that basically showed that black gay men who are active church members in the state, about the survey looked at interviewed folks in churches and folks who are not in churches in Alabama who were HIV positive. And what it showed was that church attending men who have sex with men in the public health language were more likely to have a very low CD4 or T cell count when compared to non-church attending, right, MSM. They also were less, men who attended church were less likely to be tested for HIV than men who were out of church. And when they looked at women in those same congregations, that association didn't, in fact, there were, for women who were in church, they actually had higher rates of HIV testing, higher T-cell, CD4 counts or whatever. And so many of us are familiar with a lot of the responses that have happened in the black community around HIV/AIDS and kind of using the church as a site to sort of do prayer breakfasts and, you know, testing events with people's pastors getting tested on camera for the local news and all of those sorts of things. But then the question becomes, who has benefited from that, right? If this research could be extrapolated potentially to other places, has that been a site that, even though we've talked a lot in this conference about how black LGBT folks are in, you know, kind of black Christian church spaces, have they benefited from those same efforts? And this research study would suggest not. A couple other things, thoughts about, you know, where I think we need to be moving. I think one of the things that we have to sort of challenge this notion about, like, obviously the sort of structure of the black church is this sort of monolithic sort of body that just, you know, kind of has all these sorts of associations with it. But I also think that, like, part of what's happened is that we focus our attention in the HIV/AIDS response on what the black church did or did not do, and don't talk at all about the US public health system, the healthcare system, and these other entities that didn't do shit for black people for, or people with AIDS for, I mean, just period, for a long period of time. And certainly, but we put a lot of energy and focus on what the black church is or isn't doing, right, when their job is not you know, public health, right? Like that's not the job of the black church, right? And so I would challenge us to actually use the black church instead of focusing our energy on like kind of black Christian churches as like the sort of, you know, the moral imperative to carry out the civil rights movement, but then not actually construct real campaigns or work that they could actually mobilize. For instance, it seems to me that in a country where we now have a sort of Jim Crow situation with how Medicaid expansion has happened in this country based on the 2013 Supreme Court decision, that a primary place to use church folks is to actually, because church folks, you know, we talk about the civil rights movement. I mean, they weren't just praying, they were praying to challenge like states and policies and whatever, right? So using that as a body to then, you know, do civil disobedience to like demand Medicaid, for which everybody's paying for, but only half the country's benefiting from the expansion. And in fact, only, I think 2/3 of African Americans who would benefit from the ACA are not benefiting from it precisely because the Medicaid expansion is not happening. Right, so it's something to chew on. I also think in terms of like, you know, sex education and those things, instead of having prayer breakfast or doing the things with the, you know, church ladies with the big church hats, march the church ladies down to the Board of Education and demand comprehensive sex ed, right, as a potential strategy, you know, to shift that. Real quickly, and then I'm going to close. I think we have to pay much more close attention, especially when we think about, you know, internationally, because now, as my friend Dion mentioned yesterday, that the, you know, kind of big, you know, gay Inc. organizations are focused a lot on the South, but they're also focused a lot on the Caribbean and Africa, right, as kind of the next frontiers of places we can go help people, right, with their homophobia and whatever. And I think one of the things, although we sometimes sort of talk about the relationship between big white evangelical churches and their relationships to not only churches but also public policy makers in different parts of Africa, I think that one of the things we don't often think about is actually how those same, like we're in a, I feel like in a kind of global moment where kind of various forms of like right-wing sort of conservative policies are being moved through various kinds of religion, right? Like some of which we heard in the first presentation. But that's happening right now in the US in terms of Christianity. So these different laws that are now, people are trying to move in different states like Arizona for these like religious choice laws that would basically gut the protections under the Civil Rights Act. Although people are talking about them as anti-LGBT, they actually go much further. Like this is like religious-based fundamentalism moving right-wing public policy, and actually to sort of gut, you know, or sort of create a more sort of neoliberal state through which like privatization becomes king, and so anybody can deny anybody any access to public space or access to public services because they're a private entity, right, based on any reason. So I think these are some of the things that we have to think about differently in terms of what we think about as our sort of black church response. And the last thing I'll say, and sit down because I know I'm out of time, is we often don't also talk about the way some of this fundamentalism is also impacting people, black folks who practice various indigenous traditions or other sorts of non-Christian traditions. So that also partly is about a kind of or a kind of homophobic project, right? So we have situations, right, in Haiti where people already think about voodoo as like the gay religion in a lot of ways, and because sort of Christian fundamentalist projects faiths have become much more entrenched in Haiti and not so much Catholicism, it's actually a tax on people who practice voodoo. And also precisely because they're also seen as queer people, are being like directly attacked. And we're seeing this in West Africa and Nigeria as well, with a lot of the battles in terms of the state, the Muslims up north, the Christians in the south, and how folks who practice Yoruba or other, Ifa under the Yoruba culture, are being attacked, under these same sort of, kind of Christian, Islamic, Judeo sort of frameworks. That's it. Thank you.
I'm stay here. Stay here. Good afternoon. Let me begin by thanking all the wonderful minds and hands that came together to put on this wonderful two-day event. Sam and Yosef and Sean and Laura and all of you for being here. This feels like a great reunion to see so many wonderful people. Brother Ramsey, I'm pointing at you. We're tasked with offering concluding reflections concerning the futures of black religion, engendering the sexual futures of black religion, to be exact. And I'm just not sure that we can really talk about how to give rise to a new future in our communities without corroborating the current realities and experiences that define our existence within these communities. Or as my friend Reverend Anthony Bennett at the Mount Airy Baptist Church in Bridgeport, Connecticut, likes to emphasize in his congregation's Ma'afa celebration, the way out is back through. This is why when Yosef called many of us together a few years ago to contribute to an edited volume on this topic, I elected, with the help of Barbara Savage and Wallace Bess and many others helping me think about this, I elected to research particular forms of masculinized religious expressions that have constrained our moral imaginations and spiritual sensibilities. They have constrained our moral imaginations and spiritual sensibilities insofar as the phallus becomes the organizing symbol of humanity and identity. Now, this is an ironic and interesting claim because I actually do believe that the gods are afraid of black sexuality. I believe our gods are afraid of black sexuality because I believe that black folk are afraid of black sexuality. But when placed in a historical context in the American experience, as our sister Janet Jacobson testified to earlier on the work of, or the role of the hegemony of white nationalism in the way that it conflates black criminality and black sexuality to create a culture of fear among the dominant society, it makes sense that black folk appear to be scared of black sexuality. Because black folk are scared of black sexuality because what black folk are really afraid of is white supremacy and its accompanying attributes of demonization, dehumanization, and thus criminalization. And therefore, in order to protect our spirituality, our humanity, and our safety, our faith communities came to believe that we had to obscure, if not erase, the very thing that served as the target of white fear and obsession, our sexuality. Yet one doesn't have to be a psychotherapist to know that the very thing that one is obsessed with burying is the very thing that we will ultimately resurrect and worship. Fear, then, became a precondition of worship. And fear often is a precondition of worship, if not tied to worship. Many of us, we understand concepts like mysterium tremendum, mysterium fascinos. The very thing that repels is the same thing that we are then attracted to. And when I examined the major developments of Afro-Protestantism in the United States, particularly from the mid-19th century onward, it became evident to me that there was a particular form of what I came to call Afrophallic Protestantism developed that became operative within historically black churches and denominations. Historians created the category of muscular Christianity. That's gotten a lot of play in recent years. Muscular Christianity to describe the late 19th century push among Protestant men, white Protestant men, the push against women's leadership in the public sphere as women began moving from a privatized conception of the church, of the home, as the center of moral virtue to the next logical conclusion, which is activism in the public sphere. A public sphere that was dominated by business, by economic, by these quote-unquote highly gendered male spaces. And as a pushback against that Victorian sentimentality, there became this fascination with not only taking over the privatized spaces, taking back over the homes, taking back over the churches, but a fascination with sports and a concern for the body that grew out of a white American male concern of over-civilization, quote unquote. And it was this over-civilization that white men began to feel that was cultivating a weak American man that emphasized brain over brawn. not to mention the diminishment of small-scale competitive capitalism. Because the gender deal that was brokered in the mid-19th century was that if the home became the center of moral cultivation and moral values, the place of the women to cultivate this among their young men, then their young men would be prepared to take these virtues and attributes into the public sphere. And thrift, sobriety, industriousness would prove them well in small-scale capitalist economies. Well, what happens with the move and the push toward the kind of industrialism and the move toward corporate capitalism, where at the very moment where the attributes of middle classness, sobriety, thrift, industry, are replaced with the accumulation of luxury goods in a consumer capitalist economy. And this is taking place at the very moment that men are finding themselves, like Bob Cratchit, pushed further and further away from the tools of production, and are becoming weak men that are unable to provide for their tiny Tims, if you will. And it's within this model, and couple this with a Western imperialist urge and its accompanying civilization discourse of taking claim and laying siege to underdeveloped places, that muscular Christianity becomes both gendered, and the part that the historians left out is the way that it became racialized. This is a story of white masculinity, white fragility, and as Harper's Magazine put on the cover in 1899, a crisis of masculinity in American society. Well, I constructed this category of Afro-phallic Protestantism because I realized that these, for example, this brain over brawn model of masculinity didn't apply to black men in the late 19th century. This kind of G. Stanley Hall and Teddy Roosevelt in the early 20th century, get out, boy's life, and use your hands, right, as a way to prove your manhood, to prove your masculinity. Well, black men didn't need labor to prove they were men. But what they actually did do is unfortunately embrace the very logic that these white men were moving away from. And it's these notions of masculinity that's based upon a particular conservative embrace of Victorian virtues and values. And reclaiming, as Julius Bailey talks about, reclaiming the quote-unquote altar of the home by reinstantiating this sort of domesticity with them at the forefront, with the phallus being the thing that will save the race. And as Judith Butler talks about, it's the phallic that is the man, it's the phallus that is the woman. And it's the object where the women become participants in this, because therefore the community is seen to be redeemed through this logic. And it's an unfortunate deal that was brokered. And it was brokered within faith communities. It was brokered within popular culture. And it has come to inform our cultural memory about the high moments of black manhood, of the high moments of African American society. It's replete in the literature. We see it. We see it in Frederick Douglass narratives. We see it when he's trapped in a closet, literally, as Aaron Anthony is sexually abusing and assaulting his Aunt Esther. And at that moment, Frederick Douglass doesn't identify with his aunt, he identifies with the whiteness in him in the Aaron Anthony. And he sees himself diminished through if he identifies with his aunt. So it's only in overcoming physically that slaveholder covey that he is, according to his own narrative, able to move into manhood. We see it in David Walker. We see it in Henry Highland Garnett. We saw it in Du Bois in 1900 in the Paris Exposition, right? A lot of talk was given this morning to the politics of respectability and what a bad deal that it strikes for African American communities. Absolutely right. But we saw it with Du Bois in 1900, where he just put photographs of nattily adorned black people that really put the bow tie or put the phallus up front and privileged this as a marker and sign of our civilization, of our humanity, of our dignity. And it's this logic that we are trapped in. It's this logic of this politics of respectability that so many of us are fighting that came out of this framework. But unfortunately, as so many attested to this morning, my time is coming up, so many attested to this morning, politics of respectability is based on a logic and an ethic of fear, not of faith. So when we talk about, are the gods afraid of black sexuality? Are we afraid of black sexuality? Yes, we are afraid of black sexuality. And thus, therefore, we try to bury and we try to conceal our sexuality. And we put on performance the very thing that we think will save us, because we think it's a crisis of masculinity, and we don't understand that it's actually a crisis in the masculinity. It's a crisis in the very model itself. And instead of having communities of faith, unfortunately, we have communities of fear. We don't need to ask any more quote-unquote real black men to stand up. We need responsible African-American men to sit down and to move over so that we can begin to privilege the sort of cooperative practices and behaviors that do not assume responsibility for the target of fear of another and then project it against the very people in our community. That we have to organize, that we have to love, that we have to build our freedom upon. Our freedom is found in one another, not on subsuming one another under the logic of a white, muscular Christianity. Thank you.
Let me begin, as so many others have done, by thanking the organizers of this conference, particularly Yosef and Laura. I want to thank them for the invitation to participate in this important discussion. I want to thank Yosef not just for the invitation to participate in this setting, but to have been part of more extensive conversations that have taken place over some years as part of the roundtable. And even before that, some years ago in Philadelphia, when my primary designation as a participant was as a faculty member at the University of Pennsylvania, rather than that I hold now as a pastor. A lot of issues have been raised over the last couple of days, and so many nuances and complications offered that, frankly, my brain is exhausted. I am not in conference mode anymore. I don't have the conference stamina that I used to have. But I'm deeply appreciative of being a part of this conversation, of having the opportunity to listen to so many people talk about, to speak in response to this question of, are the gods afraid of black sexuality? And I'm looking forward not only to continuing to think about what has been said, but to trying to unpack how this might work out practically in my context over the next several months, and I imagine years. For the past 5 glorious and challenging years, I've been the pastor of the St. Paul's Baptist Church in the great city of Philadelphia. I am the church's 5th pastor in 125 years, and I am the first woman to have been elected to the position. St. Paul's is a traditional African-American Baptist congregation, sort of. It can't be called entirely traditional because I am the pastor. And I think that is important, in following your comments, Jonathan, I think that's really important to say, that there is a way in which the very capacity of our congregation, which was 119 years old when I was called there, their capacity to see a woman in the position of senior pastor, as their pastor, represents a kind of vision that remains uncommon and that does say something about the church. I think that St. Paul's got to be the church that it is and that it was when I was called there, because of its formation. Churches, I believe, have DNA. And some congregations do interesting and visionary things just as a part of who they are. And I attribute some of St. Paul's capacity to take some risks to having been led in its earliest days by a visionary founding pastor who provided the foundation for the congregation, and then by a community activist pastor who worked in the 1950s and the early 60s on issues of social justice that were specific to Philadelphia and specific not only to Philadelphia but also specific to our neighborhood. This is demonstrated by the conscious decision that St. Paul's made in the late 1950s to remain in the city at a time when they had the resources to move, and in some ways to follow their striving congregation who were beginning to make good and move out of the neighborhood where the congregation was located. But they made the decision that even though some of them were doing better, that they felt like their mission remained in the place where they were. In the heyday of St. Paul's, like so many of other Black Baptist congregations, the heyday was in this period in the 1950s and 60s. And like so many other congregations, the numbers at St. Paul's began to decline as the strivers who grew up in the neighboring Richard Allen projects made good. They left the neighborhood, they raised their children, and some of them came back to worship, but they were no longer the most convenient place. And so at the time of my election, our congregation had about 185 eligible voters. The vast majority of them over the age of 65, although I have to say they're magnificently well kept. I do need to say that about our church. They're spry folks. As I was sort of writing down my thoughts, I felt the rush of, I really love these people. They're really great folks. And 5 years in, it's pretty wonderful as a pastor to be able to say that. I know many folks who don't feel that way about the places where they serve. What I find about our church, and then I'm going to talk a little bit about myself, because that's what Yosef asked me to do, is that I think our congregation is pretty uniformly welcoming and warm. We have an enduring sense that we belong to this community and to this neighborhood where we're located, and they have a sense that what they want for the congregation is to be meaningful in the community and in the neighborhood. They are still deeply influenced by their own sense that the best of times for them were when they were the least insular and when they were the most outgoing and involved. That's the church. My own formation is complex. I started out in the Black apostolic Pentecostal tradition. We would describe ourselves probably first of all as tongue-talking, foot-stomping, Bible-believing in serious but complex and very embodied ways. I grew up in a church that was tiny, with about 30 people in the congregation. And in contrast to the testimony from Guy Ramsey last night, When I said I wanted to read books, my congregation was very encouraging. Although they did say to me when I went to Harvard, you know, don't do what everybody does, which is to go to college and backslide. So my initial, the reason why I am still Christian is because of that formation and a sense of God as a bodily reality that came from being reared in and formed spiritually in the Black Pentecostal context. But that wasn't the end of my shaping and formation. I was also shaped by being a religion major at Harvard University, because God and the way people interacted with God were the only things that I have ever really been interested in. And of course, once I got there, as a freshman and sophomore, as a religious studies major, I encountered biblical criticism. And I found the arguments for the formation of the text and it created a terrible conflict, but I found the arguments persuasive. And so then I experienced a call to preach as a very young person, and I knew I was still supposed to preach, but I didn't know what I was going to preach. And so eventually I ended up at Union Seminary, where I tried to put together my emerging skepticism about my Sunday school religion with my continued commitment to the part of faith and faithful living that still fed me. What I bring as a pastor is very much rooted in my Pentecostal formation. That is a sense that I'm supposed to be right and do right, which includes treat everybody right, as well as the way in which the intellectual and the social justice aspect of my faith came together, in a sense that what that means practically is to strive for justice and very serious attention to liberation theology. When I became a pastor, my goal was to try to figure out how to live this out in a community. And like most people who go to seminary, I had lots of ideas about how that would go. I don't think I was ever really under the illusion that you can just impose your ideas on people. But if I had ever been under that illusion, actually serving people whom I take seriously as human beings meant that I no longer could hold that. Where we are as a church is, as it relates to issues of sexuality, and I think this is why Yosef, when I said to him, why do you want me to talk? He said, this is what I want you to talk about. So I think this is why I'm invited. We are neither a welcoming and affirming congregation, nor are we a don't ask, don't tell. Like, we don't fit, thank you, we don't fit in either of those kind of ideal categories that Black churches are supposed to fit. We neither took the vote where we determined that we were going to be fully accepting of LGBT people into the life. I don't know what the language of that is. We're neither welcoming and affirming in an official denominational way, nor are we a place where people have to hide their sexual identity in order to be welcomed into the light, not only into membership and to pay your tithes, but also into the life of the congregation. Where we are is, I think, that the people of St. Paul's are fundamentally decent, and they understand that welcoming people means welcoming people where they are and who they are. And I think that derives not only from being decent people, but also from being an urban congregation that is very intentionally so. And so I was talking to someone at lunch today, and I think that the real rub for our congregation is more about how do we practice generosity that's not charity with the people who are marginal economically in our congregation, more than anything particular about people as it relates to their sexuality. I think that's really more of the challenge. Let me skip ahead. I have some more to say about where I think we are, but let me say where I think we're headed. Like so much of what I found about pastoral life, all of the changes that I hope to see in our congregation are far too incremental and take too long to come about. But what I think has to happen, and I don't think this is true just for St. Paul's, but I think it's true for religious communities that are related to authoritative texts, is that we have to have a more complex engagement with the biblical text. Our church is not terrible. Lots of people in our church are not terribly churchy. And so people live with the tensions between what the sort of story is of what they're supposed to be doing and what people's lives are actually like. They live pretty comfortably with that, but we don't live explicitly with what it means that we live comfortably with that. We don't say what it means that we take the text seriously but not literally, about lots of things. What I would like to see for us and for congregations, Christian congregations, period, is to have a more honest conversation about how we actually read and apply our scripture. As well as a more explicit and thoughtful acceptance, not only of LGBT members of our congregation, but also of heterosexual members of our congregation that are not towing the sex only within the context of marriage line either, of whom there are many. Over the time I have been marrying people, I don't think I've married 3 couples that weren't living together before they got married. And yet we don't really talk about that in the life of our congregation either. I don't dedicate babies primarily who are born to married couples. Primarily I dedicate, and a lot of times I dedicate the babies of parents whose own church won't dedicate their children because they're not married, or who won't let them stand together during the dedication because they're not married. And I don't get pushback about this from our congregation in any way. So clearly but I want us to talk about it. That's where I hope we're headed, and I think we all need to be headed in that way, and I'll give you that last minute back.
How y'all feeling? You still got energy? You still ready? All right. Let's go. I like it. I co-edited an anthology that'll come out spring 2015 with AK Press called Octavia's Brood, Science Fiction Stories from Social Justice Movements. I also teach at Portland State University in the Black Studies Department. To be clear, that's Portland, Oregon. So y'all know I'm real happy to be here with y'all. I was walking the streets of Harlem. I'm like, hey, hi, hey, hi. What is wrong with her? I should have worn like my Portland t-shirt. They're like, okay, all right, boo-boo. So who knows who Octavia Butler is? See, I love y'all. All right. So I really appreciated the point that, that Kenyon made around the ideas of alternative ideas around what gods or, sort of spiritual practices that shape our lives and lead us forward is. And, I think many folks have probably, if you've read Octavia, you've probably read Parable of the Sower, right? Which includes a book. In it, the main character is writing a book that is, in some ways a religious book. It is a political book. It's a radical book called Earthseed, Book of the Living. And so I just wanted to share one of those affirmations around different ideas of what God can be for us, right? And I think all of Octavia's main characters are women of color, and I think most of them are black women. Octavia was like, no, I'm not gonna write a white man. Y'all got that. I'm gonna do something exciting for me. So, God is power, infinite, irresistible, inexorable, indifferent. And yet God is pliable, trickster, teacher, chaos, clay. God exists to be shaped. God is change. And I think that idea of change, that idea of a higher purpose that is about change and our ability to shape it, our willingness to admit it, and our ability to shape it and to dream it and to bring it into being is the foundation of our anthology, Octavia's Brood, which is named in honor of Octavia Butler. And so just a little bit about me. I'm a proud nerd from birth. I grew up, my first memories watching Star Trek, y'all. I speak a little bit of Klingonese here and there, you know. Used to be fluent, but not a lot of call for it. So, you know, I grew up really living in these fantasy worlds, you know, most of them created by white men. And I was lucky enough to find Octavia Butler when I was still in high school, but by and large, they were these fantastical worlds where, you know, I didn't exist, or if I existed, I was a monster, a disposable character. I was really a prop, right? Not a piece of the scenery, not an actual human being. And so when I began getting involved with political organizing in high school and into college, I was like, I'm a serious radical, I'm a serious revolutionary. I don't have time for this silliness, these made-up worlds. I'm gonna put that away, and I'm gonna focus on being serious, right? Serious. I was lucky enough to be able to come full circle and find a community, one of them being my co-editor, Adrienne Marie Brown, but many other people who, were like, boo-boo, you can have both. You can be serious, and you can also have these fantastical worlds. And even more, you can be in charge of shaping those fantastical worlds in our own image, right? And I think that is the real power to us of science fiction, and that's why we felt that this anthology was so incredibly important. The science fiction in the anthology are original stories written by organizers, by activists, by change makers, by visionaries. And that was very important for us to put the folks who are doing organizing work, who are re-envisioning the world we live in every single day, in this context where they can take the issues they're working on and be given free rein to explore them, as fully and as deeply as possible. So we have folks talking about issues like criminal justice, environmental justice, immigration, war, gentrification, religion, corporate control, race, gender, sexual identity, disability, power, community, religion, right, everything. And often everything interwoven together in stories, because that's the life we lead, right? As Audre Lorde said, there are no single issues because we do not lead single issue lives, right? And so, so for us, we thought there was nothing better than putting organizers in this position of writing science fiction, which we actually came up with the term visionary fiction to kind of separate it from that mainstream dominant paradigm, white man saving the world, and we're all cowering in the corner like, stop the asteroid or the aliens or, whatever's coming, to separate it from that, to really, and we came up with some principles around that. Really the focus of it is that, visionary fiction is not neutral and does not purport to be neutral. The goal of visionary fiction is to create social change. And, so I'm, and I'm also happy to nerd out all day long with y'all later if you want and talk about critiques of mainstream sci-fi and places where we can subvert it. But, so we really wanted to come up with this idea of visionary fiction to set it apart, and also so we didn't have to argue about, well, there's not enough scientific basis in here for this to be science fiction. It's more speculative fiction or maybe magical realism, because those are my people, y'all, and we can argue about that all day long. So we're like, it's all one, y'all, visionary fiction. Because we really believe that actually all organizing is science fiction, right? All organizing is science fiction, and every single organizer and change maker and visionary is a science fiction creator. Because when we say we're working towards a world without prisons, a world without poverty, a world, where everyone has access to getting their basic needs met, has full freedom to be their full selves, that's science fiction. I mean, maybe y'all, came from a different planet and saw it, but, right? Right now, I'm guessing none of us have seen that world. But we feel that the ability to dream these concrete visions together, collectively, gives us a goal to move forward together. And we can begin to work to build the path towards those, not one new world, but many new worlds. Because I think we often get in this trap of, the scarcity model. Well, what's the one right answer? What's the one right way? I think one of the amazing things about science fiction is it's infinite planets, right? Infinite diversity and infinite combinations, which is the Vulcan, philosophy from Star Trek, just whatever. But, the idea that, there are as many ways of doing this, of creating these new worlds, as there are people in the room. We don't all have to agree. We just have to figure out ways to ensure that our visions are sort of a shared liberatory vision. And so, so for us, we felt like one thing that I think radical movements, social justice movements are really good at is critiquing, right? I think that we can really critique, and that's absolutely important. I love me a good critique, I love a break it down, right? But I think one thing that's really hard for us to do is to imagine alternatives. And I think I think that there have been conversations about that this whole time of, yes, we can critique the politics of respectability, which some of us call the politics of assimilation. We can critique that, but what do we have to offer in contrast? And I think one of the important things about science fiction or visionary fiction is it allows us to imagine complete systemic transformation and change that is often very hard for us to think about. And I think one example that's really useful is around prisons and the prison industrial complex, which Kenyon talked about a little bit, right? And so folks, I'm sure, I'm guessing most of us are not pro-prison industrial complex. I'm gonna assume that, right? I'm gonna assume, okay, all right. Just say yes. But then the question becomes, well, what's the alternative, right? And I think when we're talking about prison abolition, the vast majority of folks have never seen that, right? I mean, to the vast majority of us, prison abolition is science fiction. But science fiction is a testing ground, right? That's, my co-editor, Adrienne Marie Brown, says that science fiction is the perfect testing ground for us to begin to say, well, what would this look like on the ground? So now harm has been done in the community, and what happens next, right? And to really be able to look at the ways that has already manifested in science fiction, as well as collectively get together and write our own science fiction. One of the things we've been doing with the books is facilitating collective writing together in science fiction, to be able to talk about dreaming, within organizations, so that it's not just our own individual. I know a lot of times it's the writer with their keyboard by themselves. I guess no one uses pen and paper anymore, but but really, how do we as organizations, as communities, dream together? And so, I think that's the really important piece. And for me, I offer visionary fiction to y'all not as an answer, but as a process, right? I don't think that all of us being nerds and wearing Star Trek uniforms or Doctor Who scarves is going to, change the world. But I think what is useful is this process of visionary, fantastical, dreaming new worlds together. And I think that it is to me, one of the few processes that allows us to really challenge that entire idea of the politics of respectability, or the politics of assimilation, right? Because the idea of the politics of assimilation is we want access to an oppressive system, right? We want neo-colonial power within that system. We want to have enough power that we can enact oppression upon other folks and lessen our own oppression, right? So rather than saying, well, how do we reform that concept, visionary fiction allows us to say, we don't even need to engage with that concept. We're going to go to an entirely different planet. We're going to go to an entirely different time period, a different universe, and start from scratch, right? So we're just going to build it up, from the bottom. And, I think Parable of the Sower offers us, and Parable of the Talents, which is the sequel that Octavia Butler wrote, offers us visions of what could society look like when we say that, when we center those folks who have been marginalized, when we center those folks whose intersecting identities actually make them the experts about survival outside of a system, and we take guidance and leadership from folks like that. And I think the really useful thing that Octavia gives us is it's not perfect, right? You know, I'm reading it and I'm like, oh, that part, I don't know about that part. And Octavia, you know, that's one of the things about her. She was real. She's like, you know, we're not going to create something perfect. We're going to create something flawed and hopefully better and continue the eternal process of growing it and making it even stronger. And I think that that is what is incredibly useful about the idea of visionary fiction. Because visionary fiction allows us, again, to center those folks who have been marginalized and really to create the space to recognize and honor that ability to live outside of acceptable systems, right? Outside of the politics of assimilation and the politics of respectability. And center them as leaders for creating these new worlds and these new communities. And so queer Black DJ scholar Lene Denise has a quote where she talks about a whole new understanding of the unique place Black trans folks occupy, a day of remembrance, holding light to the shapeshifters among us, right? Which I think is an incredibly powerful idea. And again, this idea to change and to shift and to grow is something that we need to all internalize, because again, the goal is not just about inclusion. The goal is about complete transformation and completely shifting the frame. So one of our stories in Octavia's Brood, called Hollow by Mia Mingus, takes place on a planet where folks who are called the unperfects, folks who are dealing with you know, different physical abilities, folks who are using canes, who have wheelchairs, they have been put by the perfects, right, to die on this planet. And instead, what they do is create an incredible society that is centered around them, that is not about, you know, disability equality or disability justice. They are empowered and liberated, right? They are operating in a sphere of total liberation. And I think that that's what is incredibly important, that, you know, we talk about decolonization processes. I think that, you know, the decolonization of our imagination is probably the most subversive and dangerous decolonization process, right? Because I think that forms the foundation for us to continue all of those other decolonization processes. But we cannot decolonize if we cannot even imagine there exists anything outside of the colonial structures in which we were raised, in which we live, right? And so I think that, again, that visionary fiction offers us a process to begin to ask ourselves, what would total liberation look like, right? Because I think what's also very important is to recognize not only is everyone who engages in social change a sci-fi creator, but I think it's important to recognize that everyone who comes from a historic background of oppression and trauma is walking science fiction, right? Every single one of us in this room is walking science fiction. So someone dreamed you up and then bent the universe and changed reality to create you, right? And both Adrian and myself, you know, are Black women. And so for us, we think of our enslaved, you know, Black ancestors in chains. You know, in the 1850s, or, you know, early 1860s, after the Fugitive Slave Act is passed, having no reason to believe that, you know, that liberation was possible. They still dreamed that liberation. They did it. They made it work. We exist because of them. We are their science fiction legacy, and we, in turn, have a science fiction responsibility to the next generations who are coming to continue dreaming collectively and then doing the hard and precious and incredible work of making those dreams reality. And so I just want to end with one more Earthseed verse, which anyone who knows Octavia, feel free to recite along with me, right? All that you touch, you change. All that you change, changes you. The only lasting truth is change. God is change. Thank y'all.
Well, what a powerful way to end our gatherings for this evening with this very rich, thought-provoking, and powerful panel. And so can we give them all another hand? As I listened to each of the presentations, and as I've been able to be a part of this conference, the one word that comes to mind, or concept that comes to my mind, is that of the fact that we are living in a Kairos time, a time that is God's time, a time that is pregnant with possibilities for God's future. A Kairos time is a time filled with pain, suffering, woundedness, and chaos, as it is a time in which God disrupts the way things are to bring us to a new way of being and thinking. And so as we open our time of discussion and questions for this panel, I want to do so by asking a question to each of you in broad strokes. And that is, how do we capture the Kairos? How are we to respond to this time that is God's time, calling us to a new place, a new future, and a new way of being? Amina, as I listened to your presentation, and as you spoke about from the Islamic tradition about who we believe God is and who God actually is, at least as that is testified to in the sacred text, I wonder, as I thought of this Kairos time, how then do you believe that we can bridge the gap between our theological imagination and our theological practices? And Kenyon, as I listened to you speak, particularly in relationship to the Black church, and heard you speak of the ways in which we understand the Black church and who the Black church, or what the Black church actually is, and the expectations that we have for the Black church and the reality of what that church can do, I wonder how you think we can bridge the gap between our ecclesiastical imagination and our actual ecclesiastical practices. And then, Jonathan, as I heard you speak about our understanding of Black masculinity and our understanding of what it means to be a male, but actually what it ought to mean to be a Black male, I wondered how we could sort of bridge the gap between, as you opened up in this concept of our moral imagination, how can we bridge the gap when we think of Black masculinity between our moral imagination and our moral practices? And then Leslie, even as you talked about your experience in your church and the possibilities, what the foundation for you, that you believe to be the possibilities for change, I wondered how indeed, again, you bridge the gap between the possibilities and the practice, even as you talked about possibilities, yet the way your church practices what it means to be welcoming. And then, Walidah, as you led us through the literary imagination of Octavia Butler, and you spoke so passionately about visionary fiction and science fiction, it led me to wonder how we bridge the gap, again, between science fiction and reality. In essence, my question to all of you, each of you, as we capture the kairos is how, and this is where we are all often left in these conferences, is we are left with an imagination of the possibilities of God's future, but we never know how to get there or how to make it real. And so that's my question to each of you, if you could say a word and then we can open it up. And everyone can speak at once.
All right, I'm going to take it up because actually I have dedicated my life to bridging the gap between theological imagination and practice. So I have a sort of long sentence to give you, and that is that we have to learn to center our being in order to be able not to become static, but rather to be able to grow and change, and therefore it doesn't matter where we are in order to access that center and that balance. And I'm convinced that the way to do it is actually with an embrace of ritual, so that we actually locate ourselves in whatever imagination that we might project in terms of our notion of God or goddess.
Thank you.
I guess I'll start kind of where I ended, and where the kind of transformation of my own thinking about this, which is I think the beginning place is to hear people say and tell their stories about the ways in which these seemingly abstract theological concepts and assertions have material and actual impact on people. Because I think sometimes we say things, and in churches we say lots of things that we don't mean. And I think the places where the conversation gets real is as people talk about in their lives the consequences of those statements being lived out in their lives. Mm-hmm. So I think some of it is really just about taking more seriously the impact of the assertions that we make theologically and biblically for ourselves, but also hearing other people talk about that. So I think that's the starting place in this bridging.
To respond about the constraining of moral imagination by particular conceptions of black masculinity and how we can try to dismantle and displace that toward moral practices. I have a friend named Griffin who about 10, 15 years ago, right out of college, he started a program called Project Uganda, right? He basically was in church here in New York. He was in the choir. The pastor called upon him, called him in and said, I understand that you're living with another man. And Griffin said yes, and he said, well, I need you to step down from heading the praise team, right? And so Griffin, he steps down and he decides he wants to go find himself. And so this gay black man from New York decides to go find himself in Uganda. Really ironic, right? And it's there that he begins teaching students, orphans, right? And he creates this project called Project Uganda. He raises a lot of money for it. This project ends up, he comes back and with his partner, who's a screenwriter and does music videos, they actually create a musical, right, called Witness Uganda, right? It won an award here in New York. Tony Award winner Diane Paulus, the executive director of the at Harvard Arts, brought it to Cambridge, and Griffin is the main character. He plays himself, and it won all of these awards. And now they've been talking about putting it on Broadway. There's been some chatter, I don't know from where, but there's been some chatter about replacing Griffin. Griffin is about 5'10", 70 pounds, soaking wet. Right? And part of the chatter has been about getting a lead figure that is a little bit more attractive and could possibly be a bigger draw. Right? And there has been a concerted effort on many of us who have brought Witness Uganda, the musical, and the ensemble to varying churches, including Memorial Church, Harvard University, and we've tried to get them around because the story is so powerful. The story is life-transforming. And you see how this young man, 70 pounds soaking wet, can carry the weight of 12 orphans on his scrawny shoulders while living under the conditions that we're moving toward what we have seen in the latest political developments in Uganda. And part of the reason that we've been pressing so hard in organizing to make sure that Griffin, if this goes to Broadway, is front and center. I love the tradition of Paul Robeson. I love Dennis Haysbert and Denzel Washington and Taye Diggs and all of that model and what that represents. Mm-hmm. But to see that black masculinity and manhood and strength and power take so many different forms. That's what I meant when I said sometimes it's for responsible men to sit down and move over, because the quote-unquote people who are doing the heavy lifting for the betterment of our community don't always look like Paul Robeson.
Right. While other people answer the question if they desire, if there are people in the audience who have a question, could you come forward so that we know you're there, and then people could give a quick response, and then we'll open it up if you'd like. Kenyon, you were going to...
Yeah, I just would say real quick, because I want to get to the audience too. That, I mean, I just would say, for me, the bridge is partly about, I'm really ambivalent about like questions of morality. I'm more interested in ethics. And so I think if we move a politics of ethics, I think the kind of, the dynamic of the, you know, again, the kind of black church as this sort of like imaginary, static, moral arbiter of, you know, of morality, right? And it gets deployed by racist white people, right, all the time. And really kind of, to me, center more around a politics of ethics. To me, that's a bridge for me that I'm interested in, and then I want to hear other people.
Did you want to speak to it, or did we?
Yeah, I mean, just quickly on how to bridge the kind of visionary fiction and reality. Just do visionary fiction, you know? I mean, the majority of people we reached out for the anthology had never written fiction, let alone science fiction. We reached out to folks we knew were doing amazing work, we knew who were good writers, but had never kind of explored it in that way. And in fact, we got several emails back that were like, you sent this to the wrong person because you're asking me to write sci-fi. We're like, no, we mean you. And the majority of them said no at first. They said, no, I can't do this. That's not what I do. And we said, just sit with it and think about it. We went back to them 3 weeks later, and the majority of them were like, we've already written like 60 pages. How long does it have to be a novella? I just have all these ideas. Because I think we have these visions inside of us, and all we need is a tiny outlet, and they come pouring out, right? Like a mighty flood. And so, you know, my dream would be that every single one of our meetings and gatherings has a visioning section where we talk about our dreams of the future that aren't constrained by these ideas of what is realistic. I think that we do need to plan strategically, right? But I think that's different than these ideas we're being told about what's realistic, because the reality is enslaved black folks were told freedom was not realistic. What was realistic was to think maybe you could get a little reform so you could get a kinder, gentler slavery, right? And those enslaved black folks said, absolutely not, and we are going to take our total liberation. And they changed the entire world by doing that, and they birthed us, right? So I feel like we have a responsibility to stop being realistic and to actually start dreaming together and visioning together what those futures could be.
Yes, sir.
Jonathan, this question is directed towards you. There's a relatively unknown Ebony article, the dialogue taking place between James Baldwin and Audre Lorde. And about midway through, Audre touches upon, she says briefly to James Baldwin, speaking upon the vulnerability that comes with the deconstructing of black masculinity, with black men quite simply being open. And my question to you is, and I guess this coincides to science fiction in regards, what does that look like to you? Because that vulnerability, it's one thing, as you said, for black men to sit down, but whether hetero or homo, black men being open, that's not, I don't know what that looks like. I don't know, it doesn't feel good, feeling open and being open to whatever that can come into you. So can you speak upon that vulnerability, that language? What does it look like to you? What do you see?
Can I ask if we can get a couple of questions at a time so we can get through everyone, and then people can be thinking about?
So first of all, I'm really appreciative of this panel because you all brought something to the conference that was really necessary, because it is sort of based, we're talking a lot about Christianity and black churches, so I appreciate all the differences that come in. Walidah, my question is for you, and it's sort of a comment, which is that, one, thank you for bringing liberation into the space and using that language. And what you allow for us to do, a lot of people who are raised as Christians, are steeped in Christianity, we are sort of bound by a text that it documents encounters with God, right? And those encounters that we value are in that text. But what you help us to do is, with visionary fiction, is what are our own encounters right now with God, and why don't we write those down and value those in the same way? So my question for you, though, is, are you influenced at all by surrealists, right? So black surrealists like Aimé Césaire, and I'm thinking really about like Robin Kelly's Freedom Dreams, and how does that come into play with visionary fiction? So thank you.
Thank you. Jonathan, do you want to respond?
Yeah, I didn't quite hear the last part, but I did get in terms of what does it look like in terms of a kind of call to sit down. I think that was the kind of...
Right, he wanted to know what black masculinity looks like given this sort of understanding of vulnerability, et cetera. Yeah, what's black male?
What does that look like? I can't, theoretically, I can talk about it, as a sister said, I don't know what it looks like. What is it supposed to look like? Where do I go? I don't need this in theory.
What he's asking, it seems to me, is in a model of black masculinity, how do we embrace vulnerability?
How do we embrace vulnerability? Yeah, I mean, there's this moment that when I talked about, when I used the language of, politics of respectability, when I was starting off, saying that, kind of the way forward is to go back through and to understand the historical roots of particular structures that are now in place, that in order to corroborate the realities of communities, right? I was actually trying to push to move to this kind of place of vulnerability. Because what I was thinking, and I was using the specific language of James Baldwin in an interview with Kenneth Clark, where he was talking about what Malcolm X offers the African American community. And he was saying in terms of future vision, for Baldwin, it wasn't much because it was a little too nihilistic for Baldwin's taste and it wasn't grounded in enough love. But what he says that Malcolm offers people is that he corroborates black folks' reality. He corroborates their suffering, right? And to identify the roots of the ways that we have been bound up in particular images and conceptions of masculinity that have been bequeathed to us, that have actually become tyrannical over us, I think is the first move to a point of vulnerability, because we're just acknowledging it, right? I mean, we're just acknowledging that that the price of the ticket is too high, right? So that's the first part. And then the second part, in terms of, the call to sit down, again, I mean, I understand that that's a rhetorical move, right? I'm a Negro preacher. but it's also a kind of calling out of privilege, right? And it's a calling out of male and masculine privilege, right? And so it's a sitting down as a moral act, right? It's not a passive act, it's actually a moral act, and it's an ethical command that we have a responsibility to use our privilege to open up and create the spaces, right, for others, that we could actually begin to project different visions of what Black humanity looks like, not masculinity per se, but what Black humanity looks like. And that was one of the reasons I gave in terms of, you know, how I think actors and others should rally around people and actors like Griffin, right, to make sure that their physical body, not just their stories, not just their stories, there's something about the actual physical texture of his body, right, that calls into question moral assumptions about who and what is strong and who and what is a leader, right? And so that's what that call looks like. And I think in just doing that and saying that we have to share the load, we have to share the load. And just because you have on a three-piece suit does not mean that you are strong, right? Just because I was about to go somewhere with the Ferguson Memorial funeral service, but I'll leave that alone. But play with that in your imaginations, the kind of scene that was set in Michael Brown's funeral, right?
Thank you. You will lead in. We've got about 5 more minutes, so we'll get this and the last 2 questions. Thank you.
Then I'll be brief. So I appreciate, yeah, the comments and the connections that you're making. I think that they're really important. I mean, you know, I think the fundamental thing around decolonization is questioning everything that we've been told, you know, is true, is right, is realistic. It's deconstruction, right? And I think that visionary fiction sometimes allows us to question things we didn't even know needed to be questioned, right? I feel like, you know, certainly in my learning process, reading science fiction and reading, I mean, the first time I learned about multiple genders was in science fiction, right? They were aliens, but they were multiple genders. And, you know, I'm 14, it blew my mind. I'm like, wait, everything I thought I knew is now not true, right? And so I think that ability, you know, I think that often we think of deconstruction as a negation, right? As a complete tearing down. But I think that what visionary fiction allows us to do is to do it in a way that feels, to me, empowering and inspiring and hopeful, not saying, well, now we've torn everything down, we have nothing, right? But instead, going through an active process of reimagining, of dreaming while we're rebuilding. And I think that that's really important. I think a lot of times we talk about, you know, well, we won't see liberation in our lifetime. We're doing this for the generations to come. I think that sounds really sad to me, right? Because I feel like that just feels like going to work and saying, well, your kids will get your paycheck when you're dead. And, you know, so I'm like, I want them to have money, but I would also like a little money right now, you know, if we're going to use a capitalist analogy. So, you know, what which, you know, I don't need to, but I did. But, you know, so what I think would be amazing is to dream those futures now and to begin bringing pieces of those futures now to recognize we can build those communities, right? We can build the new world in the shell of the old, right? We don't have to deconstruct to the ground to nothing before we begin dreaming fantastical visions that are absolutely realistic and possible.
Hi, my name is Darrell Brooks. I'm a 3rd-year doctoral student at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And so thank you all for the panel. Thank you all for being here. And so I've been in the space most of the day, and not really all of the day. And I haven't heard much about this concept of love. I heard it mentioned here on a couple of times on the panel. I've heard some other language around social justice and decolonization. And so what I'm interested in is sort of what is the place of love, and sort of really referencing Dr. King's sort of notion of love that does justice, and not sort of the emotional, simply easily romanticized pieces. How does that show up in your particular work? And then sort of what in going forward, I think, given that this is the last panel of the day, sort of what does a Black queer politics of radical regeneration and restoration look like? And sort of how do we begin to start building that? Yeah.
The place of love and the Black queer politics of radical
Restoration
and regeneration. Restoration and regeneration.
Radical restoration and regeneration.
We'll take two at a time so they can answer. We'll take this last one.
Good evening. My name is Peter Heltzel from New York Theological Seminary, and I'm wondering how we translate the call for visionary fiction into hopeful realism in a politics of love. Because as Fred Moten says in the Undercommons, we need this kind of outside, under-prophetic imaginary of a world outside of the colonial, capitalist, white supremacist regime. But then how do we use the place that we have been carefully planted and the access that we have in order to embody a liberationist ethic within the institutions of higher education, the church, and the government?
Thank you. Big questions, good ones to wrap our discourse up on. So whoever wants to take on
I'll start with Darrell's question about love. I mean, so for me, it's been kind of an interesting journey because recently a lot of sort of folks know me better from kind of doing queer-specific politics and queer-specific, especially in terms of my writing, real critiques around kind of race and like the kind of equality sort of frame and that kind of work, right? And it was a way in which I started to just feel kind of beat up around it because I felt like it didn't, even my critiques of all of that, which I felt like was generative and adding to a range of conversation over the last 10 years, was just it played out today, not through me, but through some other people who asked some questions like you can't, like they're just now, like you can't ask certain questions about like what any of like some of that agenda looks like, and even when Black folks begin to discipline that space of those conversations, I find really weird. So I just have like stopped writing about that stuff or whatever, and so part of my shift to really focusing more on HIV and even infectious disease broadly, because I do also TB and hepatitis C work, is that like I don't like to see Black suffering, right? And even in that way, which feels very, very practical, like, and very, very like, I am literally like fighting so that like we don't have drug shortages of tuberculosis drugs in the United States, like with the FDA and CDC every day. That's like part of what I do. And that's because and even think about the stuff that we do on the global level around those issues, like that's out of love of Black people, right? Because we're suffering from all of that stuff and from the lack of it. I mean, it was surfaced in the Ebola conversation. So what I've been yelling at people on Facebook about is that the racism started before Duncan showed up in Texas, boo. The racism started when there was no investment in like research and development for like a cure for treatments for Ebola 40 years ago when we first discovered the shit. So like, and it languished, and I'm not saying that to be like, but seriously, it took, and people, if you worked in public health and infections, people knew that we were gonna have another Ebola crisis. That has been the conversations for the last like 8 years. And people let it happen. So it seems like a point, like for me, like rage is about love. Because if I don't give a shit, I'll go home and, watch, whatever, How to Get Away with Murder or whatever I'm watching. So for me, that is about love, and it's about love of not wanting to, of wanting to try to, in the ways that I can, end Black suffering.
Good. Someone respond, one last response.
I'll offer that for me, what it means to love on a practical level has to do with doing the hard work of staying in the room and having the difficult conversations and allowing us how people don't magically become what we think they ought to be as soon as we think they ought to be it. And that a lot of times what happens, and this is true, I think for me as a pastor in general, is that a lot of times I have felt like I was waiting on people to get stuff And I didn't see that I was actually, there was some stuff I wasn't getting. And that it was, and that's how, it's, to me, the loving relationships that are positive and good do that for us, even in the spaces of their difficulties. They help us to become. And the part of the problem with the model that you're critiquing is that it's really all about some, you know, some wonderful man reshaping community and telling us what we want to be, and then we argue about which version of that we want it to be. It's, that would, and there are ways in which that would seem lovely, as long as that, except it's not lovely. It's actually oppressive. Even if you end up with a nice outcome, the process is oppressive. Loving processes take a lot of time and they're hard. And what it means to be with people is to engage in those processes and to have difficult conversations and to walk off in a huff and then show back up again. That's, to me, that's what loving is.
All right. Thank you. Let me end by, as Joseph comes up, and say this, that end on this thing of love, that to be sure, that Laura and yourself and those who worked with them came together and did the hard work of pulling together this conference on a difficult and hard subject matter, but something that we need to continue to come together to talk about and to recognize that whatever it is that we believe our gods say about sexuality, what we believe our gods say as well as what they actually say, but perhaps even more what we believe they say, matters. And it matters in the way in which we relate to one another, and certainly the way in which we relate to God. And what God really does have to say about who we are as human beings, as embodied sexual beings, also matters. And these are discussions that are hard to have, but they are discussions that are necessary to have. And to be sure, we all know that it is out of love for who we are as people, as black embodied beings in the diverse ways in which God has created us as black embodied beings. It is out of love for who we are that Yosef, Laura, and his committee came together and did the hard work to bring us all together. And so we thank you, and we want to thank you, and we thank you for loving us.
Formal closing remarks or recap of the conference, because I think the messiness and the beauty of the conversation over the last couple days is what we hoped for. We'll just say that I think several folks have commented on our conversation as something that's very much a product of the moment, right? That's something that the moment has produced. And in the initial planning, just observing and participating in work on these topics over the last 5 years was just a sense of, while being one running on the tenure track rat race, which is itself a privileged rat race that I appreciate, the observation that religion and race and gender and sexuality were coming together in both public conversations and in academic debates in a way that bringing folks together who are brilliant and in working on all these various issues in our various corners could simultaneously make a meaningful contribution, if intervention, both in academic and public conversation simultaneously. And we hope that there would be intergenerational exchanges, interdisciplinary inquiry, that activism and academia would be together in a way that reflects the reality of our lives, that research that captures the full complexities of black bodies and their fullness in time and space, but also that scholarship might, in some and minor way, not in a naive way, contribute in generative ways to the way we know it has to our lives in service to those same bodies. So it's been a privilege, a pleasure. I know that our Director of African American Studies, I want to thank, of course, all of our co-sponsors, thank all of you, all of our panelists for the rich conversation. It's been a pleasure. It's never been so easy to work with so many folks who just said, I want to come. So thank you. And then let me pass it over to our director who has been so supportive, Sam Roberts, the Director of African American Studies here at Columbia. Thank you.
Good evening. I'll be very quick. I just didn't want to let the evening end without saying thank you to all of our panelists and our participants, everyone in the audience. This has been a wonderful 2 days. This has been a week. My sister, Leslie, Reverend Dr. Leslie Callahan mentioned something about not being in conference mode, and I think I beat her by that. Yesterday morning, I was not in conference mode at all. It was a long week. One in which I found myself short, what they say, a minute late and $1 short on pretty much everything that I owed to everyone this week. And the past 2 days have been entirely invigorating, and I want to say thank you to everyone who's been a participant, and including all of the audience. I also want to say thank you on behalf of the Institute for Research in African American Studies to all of you for making this a wonderful event. We do a large conference every year. Believe it or not, with all the work that went here, we start all over again starting tomorrow. So please keep your eyes open on Twitter, Facebook, etc. for next year's event, which I believe will be provisionally titled Black Girls Matter, which is looking at young women and this moment, this neoliberal moment of gender, which we find ourselves with My Brother's Keeper. So I don't want to give away too many of the spoilers, but please keep your eyes open for that. We do this every year. We do many other events in between, and there's really one reason why we do it. It's to continue these conversations. And so it is very important, and we really relish your attendance and your participation. Again, I would like to thank everyone for not just the conversations, but also the intellectual and spiritual nourishment that I think we've all gotten from this. I think there's been more here than just the kind of intellectual exchange, but the kind of exchanges that come from deep investment and real concern and hope and hope for futures, as one of our panelists mentioned this evening. Finally, I'd like to thank the hard work of the team that put this together. That includes, of course, Jennifer Leith, Laura McTighe, Derek McQueen, Sharon Harris, Sean Mendoza, and of course, Yosef Surratt. Yosef has been with us for a number of years now, and he has brought the kind of dynamism and activity to IRAAS that we have all enjoyed. It's been a pleasure. I was going to say a pleasure working with him on this conference. I did not do much on this conference at all. I kept in touch with him every time he told me how things were going. I said, glad you're doing this. I'm going to stand back. Better you than me. He has brought the kind of energy as I think to which many people have attested over the past 2 days. Thank you so much to everyone. This has been fantastic. Have a good evening. We look forward to continuing this on.